They call it the post-spawn funk for a reason. Let's face it, a lot of us have been going out and catching big pre-spawners, roaming the shallow flats. You're catching spawners that are up there getting around those shallow pieces of isolated cover. During the month of June, during the post-spawn, things can get pretty difficult because bass are in transition. They're moving out of those shallow water areas, moving out towards their summertime locations. But I'm going to teach you guys about a pattern that's going to help you catch bigger than average fish this time of year, and that's fishing around the bluegill spawn. Especially for big largemouth, this is a phenomenal pattern that can give you some success during the post-spawn. And in today's video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about fishing around the bluegill spawn to have success. Let's dive into this thing. Now, if you guys don't know who I am, my name is Benjamin Nowak, and this channel is dedicated to teaching you bass fishing tips, taking you on trips, and teaching you about things such as fishing around the bluegill spawn to catch bigger than average largemouth bass. So if you guys enjoy that style of content and are not already subscribed, I would really appreciate it if you consider subscribing to the channel and growing this community. It's turned into something really cool over the past couple of months. You know, a lot of guys sharing stories, sharing tips, sharing a lot of information down in the comment section down below. So consider subscribing to the channel, joining the community, and building this into something bigger and better. Now, without further ado, let's dive into fishing during the bluegill spawn to have success for big largemouth bass. Now, like I mentioned, this is really the post-spawn time of year. This is when this bite is going to happen. And it can be very difficult because those bass are in transition. They just got done spawning. They're moving out. A lot of those fish are moving out of the shallow water zones, and so it can be difficult to figure out where these fish are located. But there's one bite that I resort to during the post-spawn to consistently have success, and that is fishing around the bluegill spawn. Fishing around those bluegills that are hanging out in the shallow water, spawning, and those big bass are hanging out nearby. But let's face it, this is not a numbers game for me. I'm not out there offshore on these ledges with massive 100-fish schools. I'm up there shallow, chasing these big largemouth that are hanging out there feeding on bluegills. This is a 5 to 15 bite day, but they're going to be the right kind. This is a big fish bite for me, and this is one of my favorite ways to catch them, including topwater, a jig, and a NEKO rig, to catch those fish that are still hanging out in the shallow water zones. Now let's start by talking about when this bite happens, and I've alluded to it a couple times, but it's really during the post-spawn, the immediate post-spawn when those bass are pushing off bed, moving out in transition, when those water temps are between 65 and 75 degrees, and they're going to get up there in those shallow water zones when those water temps are between 65 and 75 degrees, and they're going to spawn. But this also happens around moon phases. So I just got done paying attention to when the bass are spawning around the full moon and new moon. The bluegills are going to do the same thing. I'm going to pay attention to the full moon period, the new moon period, and that's when you're going to see the biggest wave of bluegills push to the bank to spawn. So between 65 and 75 degree water temps, those full moon and new moon periods, plus or minus 1 or 2 days, you're going to see these big waves of bluegills push up into shallow water zones. So what you need to know, this happens between 65, 75 degrees around those full and new moons. You're going to find the biggest congregation of bluegills spawning in those shallow water zones. Now, where does this happen? Where am I looking? I'm still looking around the same locations where I found those big bass spawning. So those bays, those protected bays with hard bottom areas, it could be lily pad fields, but one of the biggest keys for me is finding these areas that has cover adjacent to it. So I want, these bays that are protected where bluegills can spawn in these sandy areas, but then I want like a dock hanging out nearby, or I want like an inside grass line, or I want like an isolated piece of cover, because those bass, while the bluegills might spawn in this area, those bass need an area to hang out and ambush those bluegills as they come by or as they get hungry. So I'm looking for those areas with isolated pieces of cover nearby, because the bass aren't typically going to hang out in the bluegill bed. They're going to hang out nearby that bluegill bed where there's some cover or some area that they can hang out adjacent to it to ambush those big bluegills as they get up on bed. One of the other big things, and I don't have them with me right now, but having a good pair of polarized sunglasses is really important this time of year. A lot of these bluegills are going to spawn in less than 5 foot of water, so you're going to be able to visually go down the bank and see these honeycomb looking bluegill beds. And bluegills spawn a little bit differently than largemouth. You're not going to see like one isolated big bed. It's going to look like little honeycomb beds, maybe the size of a basketball, and you're going to see 10 to 15 to 50 of them all right next to each other. And it doesn't have to be on the bank. I actually found some of the coolest bluegill beds last season when I was scanning out offshore, out in 6 to 8 foot of water. You'd see these bluegill beds, and then you'd see like a grass patch 10 to 15 feet outside of those bluegill beds, and you can flip into those grass patches and get those fish to bite. It can also happen around composition changes on the bottom offshore. It doesn't have to be like super offshore, but 50 to 100 foot offshore where the bottom changes from mud to sand, those bluegills will spawn in those composition changes as well. So pay attention to those bluegill beds on the bank around those shallow protected bays, but also keep in mind these bluegills can spawn just like bass offshore in those 6 to 8 foot zones where a lot of guys might overlook them. And then obviously, as I mentioned, it gets better when there's a piece of cover or isolated area where bass can hang out nearby to ambush those bluegills when they get hungry.
So I wanted to give you guys some examples of what bluegill beds look like on your electronics and how to really approach these areas, just kind of give you an understanding of what you're going to be looking for when you're on the water. Now, huge shout out to the guys over at Bass Brawl Outdoors. They sent me some different images of their 360 imaging as well as forward-facing sonar, and then just some side imaging clips that I took from their Instagram, as well as Tom Warren. And Tom is another guy that puts out some really cool Instagram content, especially focused on his electronics and how he's catching these fish. So go over, check out the guys at Bass Brawl Outdoors and Tom Warren Fishing. Those guys put out some really cool stuff. But let's take a look at some of these 360 images and how they approach this specific area on their 360 and forward-facing sonar to really attack these bluegill beds. Now, in this first image, they're facing the rock piles out in front of them. They're basically on top of the bluegill beds, which you can see just to the left of where their boat is positioned. And then the rock field is out in front of them. You can see that on both the 360 as well as on their forward-facing sonar. This next image, they're approaching it a little bit differently, where they're lined up basically directly in line with this rock patch, and then the bluegill beds are up in the top right-hand corner. And with the lineup being able to cast directly to the boulders where those big bass are hanging out, you're going to be able to trick those fish most effectively that are going to be ambushing those bluegills on the beds. I think a lot of times if you line up on the beds, you're going to spread that colony out. You're going to spread those bluegills out. Those bass are going to get smart to it, and we'll talk about that later in the video. But huge shout out again to the guys over at Bass Brawl Outdoors and Tom Warren for letting me use some of these images. I think it's really cool to be able to see what you're going to be looking for on your electronics and just how to break it down as you get onto the water.
Now that we've talked about the when and where bluegill are spawning, let's start to talk about the baits that I'm utilizing. But don't leave the video just yet because I'm talking about baits. After I talk about the baits that I'm using, I'm going to actually talk about some advanced strategies that I use to position my boat and to have more success than other guys when I'm on the water fishing around the bluegill spawn. Also, if you guys want to purchase some baits that I'm talking about in this video, I've just partnered with Omnia Fishing. You guys can now use code BEN10 to save 10% off your order. Anything you order from Omnia Fishing, using code BEN10 will save you 10% on that order, so go check that out. Now, the first bait that I'm going to be throwing, especially around active bluegill beds, when I can hear them popping, when I see them coming up towards the top of the surface, is going to be a topwater popper. This is a Labino Rio Rico. It's the larger size topwater bait. I like that little bit larger topwater, especially during the bluegill spawn, because they're keyed in on some bigger bait fish. And the Rio Rico allows me to cast this bait a lot farther. Now, this is a more premium topwater popping bait. The Strike King Splash Pop is another really good option, or the Berkley Bullet Pop is another really, really good, more budget style option. But using those bigger style topwater popping baits this time of year is what I'm going to be going with. I also really like this topwater because I can use it to walk the dog. This bait will walk really effectively. I can also spit or chug this bait, and I can use it as a traditional popper with just short pops, and it spits a little bit of water. But you can really vary your retrieves with this Rio Rico and have a lot of success. Just a lot of really good options out there. Even the Pop R, the original popper, is a great option. But some sort of topwater popping bait is a good go-to this time of year, especially when you have those active bluegill beds located. One other thing I want to mention before we get off the popper is that feathered treble hook. I really like a feathered treble on the back of that bait, especially when it's sitting still in the water. There's a little bit of movement. It gives those fish a little bit added attraction when that bait is sitting still in the water. So I'll always add a feathered treble to the back of my popper. And then an alternative to that popper, and this is something I'll throw around, grass or matted vegetation areas, is actually going to be a popping frog. Now, this is going to be really effective because you still have the cupped mouth to this bait, but you have a more weedless presentation. So if those fish are around grass or heavier cover, I'll go with the popping frog. A couple good options are the Spro Bronze Eye popping frog. This, I believe, is like an old Fitzgerald frog. And the one that Berkeley makes now is actually really, really good as well. But then at color selection, I'm going to keep pretty simple. I like, you know, a brown bellied frog. It looks like those bluegill up at the top of the water column, something white bone colored. But just keep it really, really simple with your colors. You don't have to get too crazy. The back color on a frog, to me, doesn't necessarily matter. But like a brown frog, a yellow frog, or a white frog are what I'm going to be going with when I'm keying in on those bluegill spawners up around that matted vegetation or up in the heavier cover areas. Obviously, those topwater baits are great once I have active bluegill beds found, but what I also like to do is cover water this time of year, and I really, really like throwing a swim jig. A swim jig is really effective because you can fish it around cover effectively with that weed guard, but you can cover a lot of water with this bait. You can fish it around docks, you can fish it around shallow wood or shallow vegetation really, really effectively. So I'm going to have a swim jig tied on. It also looks like the bluegills that those fish are keyed in. Now this is a Beast Coast Working Man swim jig, the 5/16 of an ounce, and I'm going to really fish this through any cover that I can get my bait around. So I'm going to skip it up under docks, I'm going to fish around isolated grass patches, and I'm looking for those areas where those bass can ambush the bluegill. Now as I mentioned, the best bluegill beds, the best areas to catch big fish are around beds that have isolated cover nearby. So I'm going to put this bait in pretty much any cover that I can find in shallow water zones, and it's going to help me locate maybe a couple extra bites throughout a day. Now what I like to do is really use bluegill style colors. This is their Dirty Money color. I believe it's like a green pumpkin with black and blue, and then has some flash in it. Looks just like a little bluegill. And then I'll pair it up with some sort of like green pumpkin style trailer on the back. This is a rage bug. I really like a rage craw and like a green pumpkin or blue craw color on the back of that. Just something that looks like a bluegill that I can swim around shallow cover. Looks like what those fish are feeding on. And this is going to get me a couple extra bites throughout the day from those fish that maybe I'm not actively necessarily fishing for around active bluegill beds. But a swim jig is a really, really effective approach to cover water, trigger a couple extra bites around those shallow pieces of isolated cover. But what happens if you're around bluegill beds and they're not necessarily super active? Those fish are on bottom. You need to fish, you know, a little bit more slowly and methodically. I love to pick up a jig. Now this is a traditional half-ounce flipping jig. And anytime I'm fishing for largemouth, this is obviously going to be tied on. But what I like about this bait is I can really soak it. I can flip it in heavy cover. I can get this bait where those fish are living. If they're not actively feeding in the bluegill beds, if they're in that grass patch, if they're on the dock posts, if they're in the shade or on the inside grass line, I can fish a jig through there slowly along the bottom and get fish to bite this. Now this is a more compact style profile. This is a homemade half-ounce compact Sparky jig from Do It Molds, and then I use a living rubber skirt on this. I love a living rubber skirt. To me, it's a little bit different than what a lot of guys are throwing, but it's in like a green pumpkin color with some flashaboo, and then I fish it with a Berkeley chicker craw, almost exclusively a Berkeley chicker craw. My colors are going to vary. I really like a green pumpkin. I'll fish, you know, like a pumpkin green flake, but something that looks like a bluegill this time of year and really match it to your watercolor. So if you're fishing really clean water, go with your green pumpkins, your browns. If you're fishing dirtier water, go to like a black and blue or a June bug. But a half-ounce flipping jig has to be on this time of year. This to me is really, really effective when you're having to fish that cover really methodically. Those fish are maybe a little bit less aggressive, less active, less up in the water column, more feeding down. That's what I'm going to pick up, this jig. Now I'm not fishing this in the bluegill beds itself typically. I'm either sight fishing bass that are cruising in the shallow water zones, or I'm using it to pick apart isolated targets such as docks, maybe inside grass lines, maybe grass patches. That's what I'm going to pick up my half-ounce flipping jig. But this is a great way to get giants to bite. This is my big fish bait this time of year. And then I have really a 1-2 approach with my finesse presentation. The first one is going to be a drop shot. This has just a tiny little drop kick shad on the back, a 2 3/4 inch drop kick shad. I also really like going to like a 4.5 or a 6-inch robo worm on the back of my drop shot this time of year. Something that imitates a little bluegill that you can kind of fish through those bluegill beds or on the inside edge of a grass line where those fish are keying in. But a little drop shot is a great way to trigger big fish to bite that are more lethargic. They've been fished for all spring long. A drop shot with like a 1/4 ounce or 3/16 weight that you can fish around the inside grass line is really, really an effective approach. And obviously you have that drop shot, but probably my go-to finesse application when I'm fishing around bluegill beds is going to be a NEKO rig. It kind of swims through the water on the fall, nose down because of that weight, and you can fish this bait either along bottom effectively or up in the water column for more aggressive fish. It's a very versatile approach. It's still something I think fish don't see all that often. It's a presentation that maybe gets overshadowed by other techniques, but a NEKO rig is so effective. And I have a whole video breaking down a NEKO rig, how to fish it effectively, so go over, check that video out, because it breaks down everything you need to know about NEKO rigs to have success this time of year. But match the colors to the bluegills that you're fishing around. I really like Aaron's Magic. It's probably my #1 go-to color, or Oxblood Light Red Flake. Really good colors this time of year. Just fish it around those isolated pieces of cover or around the bluegill beds themselves, and you're gonna have a lot of success during the bluegill spawn. So I promise you guys, after we talked about the baits, I give you guys a couple more advanced techniques towards the end of the video. And the first one that I want to tell you guys is to stay off the bluegill beds. When you come up to an area, I like to shut my motor down, way off at 100+ foot off the bluegill bed, and use my trolling motor on a low speed to kind of creep up to these areas. So when I come into that area, I'm trying to be really stealthy, trying to make long casts to those bluegill beds, and try to make that first cast into the area your best cast. I'm not going to be fan casting into my bluegill bed colony, into my zone. I want that first cast to be on that isolated target. I want my first cast to be into that grass patch, onto that dock where I know a big fish is hanging out. I don't want those fish to even know that I'm there until I'm approaching that big bass. This is something a lot of the big swim bait guys talk about, but making those first casts count, really using stealth to your advantage, and making that first cast the exact spot you want. I'm not going to be fan casting around with popper. I'm not going to throw my NEKO rig or my jig just randomly in the direction of the bluegill beds. I'm going to kind of creep up to it, figure out, okay, there's my grass patch, there's the bluegill beds, there's the dock that I think a giant is sitting on. Be really methodical approaching these areas, and you're going to have a lot more success. The other thing is these bass are going to feed in waves. So if I don't get bit in the first 4 or 5 casts, I might move off that area and come back to it. These bass are going to be feeding in waves. They're going to pull up. They're not going to hang out there all day. Now, to that point, I also like to approach this as if it's an offshore spot, meaning that there are timing windows. There's a time of day when that bluegill colony is going to be the most active, whether it's in low light, whether it's in full sun. There's a timing factor that goes into fishing bluegill beds to be really effective at it. And it's going to depend on the bed itself. It's going to depend on the bass that are hanging around those areas. So don't overfish an area. If you're not getting a bite around what you think should be a really good spot, a really good colony cluster of bluegill beds, then back off that area and come back to it later. But don't blast apart that area. Don't overfish it trying to get a fish to bite, because all you're going to do is make that fish a lot smarter and harder to catch the next time you come back to the area. So fish through it. If you don't get bit, back off, come back to it later, because there's a timing factor that goes into fishing bluegill beds that I think a lot of guys overlook. And to that point about paying attention to conditions, really focus on, is it sunny outside? A lot of times during those really sunny conditions, those bass are going to be really tight to those isolated pieces of cover. They're going to be in the area. You're going to soak a jig, you're going to fish your NEKO rig, and you're going to throw it into the heaviest piece of cover in the area. If it's overcast and maybe windy, those bass will have more opportunity to roam. You might be able to fish reaction bait a little bit more effectively to get those fish to chase or follow. They're not going to be on the spot quite as much, but paying attention to all of those conditions is going to make a difference on the approaches you use, and can maybe clue you in or get you bites that you would miss in different condition situations. But that should be everything you need to know to go out and have success fishing around bluegill beds for big post-spawn largemouth. Now, if you guys are going over and considering purchasing some of these baits from Omnia, use code BEN10 to save 10% off that order. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, or maybe share down in the comment section below something you wish I would have talked about in this video. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Click this video right here if you want to hear me talk about some other awesome topics to help you go out and catch big fish. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue your passion.